Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to my presentation on Latina women suffragists. I had the great opportunity to research and curate this exhibit during my tenure as a public history research intern for the National Women's History Museum. And the result was this exhibit, Representation with a Hyphen, Latinas in the Fight for Women's Suffrage. Oftentimes when we think of the suffrage movement, specific moments or specific women come to mind. But the truth is, it was a very complex movement involving a lot of different communities all working towards this larger goal. And for Latino women specifically, their fight was multifaceted, right? It combined a belief in advocating for women's rights, but also dedication to preserving their cultural and heritage. So while I won't be able to go through the whole exhibit today, I just kind of want to take out some of the key points and themes, and we'll kind of expand on that. And then I encourage you to check out the full exhibit on the National Women's History Museum website. And I'm going to minimize myself now so I don't get in the way of any text. All right, so some key themes and takeaways. I try to focus on four main points for the sake of this presentation. First being that there was a rich history of Spanish Mexican women being influential in local networks in the 19th century, which carried on to the 20th century. And this actually had impacts on the movement for women's suffrage. Secondly, that the story of women's suffrage was not limited to one moment or one location. The stories of the women I'm going to tell you about ranged from east to west coast, from north to south. Thirdly, Hispanic and Latino cultural were integral notions to these women's notions of civic duty and citizenship. And then lastly, the sheer breadth of Latina political activism kind of challenges our notions of what it meant to be involved in the fight for women's suffrage. So expanding upon that first point, uncovering the rich history of these Latino women in local and political networks. So I drew out the story of La Doña Tulis, and she was kind of a good example of how Spanish and Mexico legal tradition kind of afforded more rights compared to those under English common law. Under Spanish and Mexico legal tradition, women were allowed to own property, keep their maiden names, where under English common law, they were not allowed to do such things. So while there was still a delicate balance, there was a lot more responsibility and rights afforded. And so Latulis was someone who kind of took advantage of that right. When we have the Mexican-American War concludes in 1848, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo did see Mexican-American citizens become impacted, but in territories such as New Mexico, California, with this rich Spanish-Mexican heritage, women had considerable influence due to their family members being involved in the political sphere. And so they were to wield that influence later on during the suffrage movement. Secondly, Latinas' work in suffrage movement was not constrained to one moment or location. So in this exhibit, my biggest struggle was putting together all the different regional stories. So here I kind of give the glimpse at the different kinds of narratives and different kind of territories. So in New Mexico, going off my last point, Adelina and Nina Otero-Warren and Aurora Lucero White did have some considerable political influence due to their family. For example, Nina Otero-Warren's maternal uncle helped pass the Constitution in New Mexico in 1910, and they were working with the National Women's Party to pass this national amendment in 1915. In California, you have people like Maria Guadalupe Evangelina de Lopez and Selena Solomons working on rallying Spanish-speaking women for their state amendment. You have New York, Lucrecia Duval sees herself become disenfranchised, moving across the coast because California has passed the right to vote, but New York hasn't. In Texas, you have Jovita Idár, Villarreal sisters taking to the press. And in Florida and Puerto Rico, you have the fight for women's rights, actually very tied in with the fight for better labor conditions and class struggle. Thirdly, Hispanic and Latino culture were integral to notions of civic duty and citizenship. So while it was a fight for women's suffrage, Latina activists were also very concerned with preserving Spanish language, keeping that dedication to improving living conditions for their communities, and working with the themes coming out of the Pan-Hispanic movement, which wasn't solely concerned with the passage of an amendment, but rather this embodiment of legislation to advocate for human rights. And lastly, the breadth of political activism really kind of challenges our notions of what it meant to be involved in this movement. So Latinas looked to different mediums and strategies. You had Jovita Idár taking to the press to write op-eds and voice opinions. You had women adopting these culturally symbolic forms of communication, such as corrido, which is a ballad sung in Spanish, usually by men. So there's this satirical one actually sung by women and kind of telling women to take up the right to vote. And in Lucrecia Duval, she does this performance embodying Señora Yoruba to make a claim to her citizenship. So while that's all I will have time for today, I encourage you to check out the full exhibit at the National Women's History Museum website. It is available in both English and Spanish, and you can get more information there.